Hey there, I'm Stephan Kesting, and this is the Grapple Arts Radio Podcast. Good evening, everyone. This is a question and answer episode in which I'm going to be answering the questions that I got after I posted a call for questions on my Instagram stories feed. There's Instagram, which I'm on, and then there's Instagram stories in which you kind of put the day-to-day stuff that's happening. I put out a call for questions on that, got a bunch of questions in. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer them all. I'm never able to answer all the questions I get. I try. I really, really try. But I'm going to do my best. I've got about half an hour here, maybe a little bit less, before I have to head off and spend some time with my family. I'm actually on a family visitation trip right now, and that is really important to me because I don't get to see them very often. So, the first question comes from Benjamin, who says, "Thanks for all the quality content. My question is, what would you tell yourself as a white belt if you go back in time? Anything you wish that you focused on more or less?" That's an interesting question, and it's hard to answer it without going completely 20/20 hindsight. For one, of course, the situation, the lay of the land has in Jiu-Jitsu and training martial arts has completely changed since I started training. There are now so many more resources available, and they're so much better in general than they used to be. So I took as much advantage as I could of the VHS material that was out there, but honestly, a lot of the instructionals back then were pretty poor. You really didn't get very much for your money. You'd spend a couple $100 on a VHS set, and each VHS tape would show you 5 to 10 techniques, not very well taught, no pedagogy, no teaching method at all. And there was never a system. It was just a bunch of random techniques. So, again, this wouldn't have been possible when I was starting, but if I was starting out now, I would take a lot more advantage of the teaching materials that are out there, be it the stuff on YouTube, the stuff in DVDs, the stuff on apps, the online streaming content, because really somebody has taken a ton of their experience and distilled it down, and for relatively little money, you can get kind of a brain transplant of that person's entire game, something they spent years and years researching and developing. The other thing that I would have done is maybe paid a little bit more attention to rehabbing injuries and recognizing when certain injuries are happening, because I'm here from the future to tell you that every injury that you have in your 20s and your 30s comes back to haunt you in your 40s and 50s. So really, really paying attention. If you're interested in longevity in the sport, which I am, really making sure to minimize the number of injuries you have and making sure to rehab the ones that you have properly, and recognize that sometimes if you've got an existing injury, say you injure your knee, and say every time you go for a run or do cardio or do rubber guard, you injure that knee again, you know what? Rather than taking that risk, maybe it's time to change what you do. Maybe instead of rubber guard, you start playing half guard. Maybe instead of running on the streets, you start doing the Stairmaster. Maybe you start rowing. Maybe you start swimming. So adapting your game, you have to basically change your game every 10 years. I'm going off on a tangent here, but it's something that Daniel Santos said years ago, that you basically have to evolve your game every 10 years. What works for you in your 20s doesn't necessarily work for you in your 30s. What works in your 30s doesn't work in your 40s. So every 10 years, you need to change your game. You're not going to be as strong or as flexible or as fast or heal as quick or be as resilient as each decade goes on. If you really focus on one area, say as you get older, you really focus on strength training, you might be able to stay the same. You might even be able to improve, but the other areas are going to fall behind. So you need to evolve your game as time goes on. The other thing that I sometimes wonder about, whether it would have made a big difference, is if I'd focused more on wrestling rather than judo. I really like judo as a sport. And of course, judo has not only the stand-up work, but it also has the groundwork. And quite honestly, the groundwork in the newaza, as they call it in judo, translates better to jiu-jitsu and submission grappling than the groundwork from wrestling does. Of course, wrestling groundwork is super useful. It's great for fighting and keeping the top position, for doing turnovers. I'm not, belittling it at all. But in terms of going for the submission, in terms of using the guard, I think Judo gives a better background. That being said, Judo's got a pretty high injury rate. There's something about getting wrapped up in a gi and having all these high amplitude throws again and again and again, that if I'd spent a little bit less time doing Judo and a little bit more time doing wrestling with a lower amplitude takedowns, I think maybe I could have avoided some of those injuries that are plaguing me now. And I think it would have carried over quite well, especially to the submission grappling parts of the game. So that's something I wonder about. I'm not 100% sure about that piece of advice. Okay, the next question comes from Scott. Question for the podcast. I've been training about a year, and I've been trying to play a lot of butterfly guard. What is the next guard that you would focus on that you think would complement the butterfly? Having issues with preventing higher belts from essentially walking around me. Would a sit-up guard be logical to help against standing opponents? Thanks, I love all your content. So that's a really good question, Scott, and he's beginning to get at something which is critical, and that is that no one guard does it all. No one guard does it all. So, the butterfly guard, typically you're going to be playing it sitting up, not lying flat on your back, and you're typically going to be playing it against a kneeling opponent. If the person stands up, which it sounds like what Scott's running into, you have to change things up. So there are other guards that complement the butterfly guard very well. The first one that I would work on, quite honestly, is the X guard. Now, I think the butterfly guard and the X guard are like the jab and the cross of the open guard game. And also the butterfly guard gives you tons of opportunities to transition into the X guard. The most classic example of that, it's going to be hard to describe on a podcast, but I think it's totally valid, is when you're doing the basic butterfly sweep from butterfly guard and the person posts his leg. When he posts his leg, you grab underneath that leg, you scoot in, and you push him, and you put him into the X guard. I've got a video about this on my YouTube channel somewhere. If you search X guard and my name, I'm sure you'll find it. And that's a super important transition for getting into X guard. So that's a different kind of guard that goes very well together with butterfly. At the same time, you have to deal with the person occasionally barreling you backwards, flattening you out, driving in. And of course, you can't play butterfly guard flat on your back. Well, you can, but it's not very powerful. It's really not a very good form of butterfly guard. You want to be sitting up. That's where all the power comes from. That's where the mobility comes from. So then, if the person does manage to flatten you out, you want to go to some other form of guard. And typically, that's going to be either a half guard or a half butterfly. So even if it's just to hold the person there, reset your hook, get the weight off of you and sit back up to butterfly, some form of half guard and some kind of plan from half guard is a really important complement to the butterfly guard. You asked about the sit-up guard, and I'm assuming that you mean when the opponent's standing, say his right leg is forward, I sit up and my legs go to either side of his right leg. What I actually prefer, Scott, is an instep guard or a shin guard, where in that case my left instep would be going against his left instep and I'd be controlling the back of his leg. Once again, if you do a search for instep guard or shin guard, you'll find lots of examples of this because it gives you a little bit more control. And from the shin guard, you can actually transition very well into both the standard X guard and the single leg X guard. And that's the final type of guard I'm going to talk about, the single leg X. The single leg X and the X guard go together very, very well. Single leg X is a little bit easier to get and a little bit less powerful, although it's still super powerful, especially if you combine leg locks with it. And the X guard is really powerful, but it's a little bit harder to get sometimes. So instead of telling you one guard to work on, if all you want is one guard, X guard. If you want a few more guards or a few more situations to think about, some kind of half guard, a very rudimentary half guard game or half butterfly game. Sit-up guard, sure, or better yet, an instep guard or a shin guard, a single leg X, and an X. So those are some guards that complement the butterfly guard really well. The next question is from Jacob. Here's my question. Do you believe it's possible to become an elite level grappler while still having a day job and a family? Or do you believe you have to commit yourself full-time to that lifestyle. I think I've got bad news for you, Jacob. Most of the elite level grapplers that you hear about and you see don't have both a day job and a family. Or if they have a day job, it's running a school, which means they get to get a little bit more jiu-jitsu training in. And thus they're not off working at the factory. They're not off at the assembly line. They're not off, scrubbing floors all day. They're kind of in the realm of jiu-jitsu. Can you do it if you just have a day job? Say you work your 8 hours a day. You've got, 168 hours in a week. So you do 40 hours a week on your job. That leaves a lot of hours left over for training. So if your main focus in life is working a day job and then training, yes, you might be able to pull it off. What you're going to run into is recovery and recuperation. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. If you have a family, it really depends how involved you are with the family. I'm pretty involved with my kids, and it's wonderful, but it makes training, doing the full-time training lifestyle hard. For sure it does. And I often fail at this. Now you're combining a day job and a family. You're going to be lucky to train a couple hours a day. Most of the elite level guys, even like the people who are winning blue belt worlds, are essentially training almost full-time. They're probably actually brown belts being held back at blue belt by their instructor so they can rack up a few more medals. So it's going to be really tough. And the main thing you need to watch out for is recovery. Yes, you can get up super early and do your conditioning. Yes, you can stay up super late and go to class. But unless you're one of these people who can get by on 4 hours of sleep a night, you're going to break down, you're going to get sick, and you're going to get injured. Overtraining isn't only training too much. It's training more than you can recover from. And the most important part of recovery is sleep. So if you start cutting into the sleep 100% for sure, you're going to get sick, you're going to get injured, you're going to get hormonally exhausted, and you're going to hate life and not do very well at jiu-jitsu either. So Jacob had another question. How important do you feel drilling is? I know a lot of instructors are not big on drilling and prefer to just go over technique and roll hard during sparring, but there are many who are huge advocates of drilling. What's your opinion? Once you're above a certain level, let's say purple belt and above, you're going to start getting an idea of what works for you. You're going to start understanding how you best learn and what the ideal way of training is for you. In my case, I like a mix of all three. I like drilling a little bit, especially when I'm trying to get a new move down. But then at a certain point, I've got to do a little bit less drilling and spend more time trying to focus on that in sparring. Maybe I'll spar it against a blue belt. Maybe I'll spar it against a purple belt. Maybe I'll spar it against somebody who's not really good at defending that position, because that's kind of like a contested drilling. But in terms of just getting the reps in, I don't do that as much once I've got a technique kind of down. Some people are huge advocates of drilling, and they do it as much for cardio conditioning as they do for muscle memory. And that's great. That works for them. Some people do hardly any drilling at all. And these are often people who've got pretty simple games, right? And this could be world-class, elite-level guys. But if they've got a fairly simple game, then they don't have to do as much technical repetition of the moves. They mainly have to focus on them in sparring. So this is super variable. Of course, the problem is, as a white belt, as a blue belt, you don't yet know your own game, your own body, your own method of learning well enough to really have an opinion about this. So you have to do all three. Yes, you have to drill. Yes, you have to go over technique and try and break technique down. And yes, you do have to try it in sparring. Essentially, you've got to cover all 5 levels of the progressive resistance training method that I covered in one of my self-defense tutorials YouTube channel videos about the 5 levels of training your martial art techniques. You have to go from pure rote repetition, then find ways to make it a little bit more applicable, a little bit more applicable, a little bit more applicable, and gradually ramp up the resistance. And eventually this will be a moot point because you'll figure out what works for you. What works for the world champion down the street may or may not work for you. It's an individual game, and ultimately only you can know what's best for you. Here's a question from Anthony. I know that we should... Let's try that again. I know we should be working on whatever part of our BJJ game is the weakest, but if all things are equal, what would be the most important area to focus on developing? Passing, guard retention, submission finish details, back control, etc. Thanks for all the material you keep on putting out. That's a really good question, Anthony. So let's assume that, as you say, all things are fairly equal. You don't know what you should be working on next. Well, I will say the thing that distinguishes Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from most other grappling systems is the guard. The thing that prevents a bigger, stronger opponent from crushing you into the ground is the guard. The thing that will save your ass in a street fight, if you get knocked down or if you end up on the bottom, is the guard. And your guard is useless to you if the person can pass it. If the person gets past your guard, anyone can win a fight sitting on your chest, punching you in the teeth. You don't need to be a skilled grappler. You need to be a pretty skilled grappler to get past a skilled person's guard. So I would say, all things being equal, guard retention. A couple really good resources for that are on my website. If you do a search on grapplearts.com for guard retention, if you do a search on the Grapple Arts YouTube channel, I think that's youtube.com/Stephan Kesting, for guard pass prevention or frame and hip escape. That'll get you to a couple of videos I did with Rob Bernacki talking about the first two of about 7 or 8 methods of guard retention. And even focusing on that very first method, the frame and hip escape, should give you huge dividends and set you up for success with the other methods. So, to jump into your question and take it at face value, if all things are equal, work on your guard retention, because without your guard, you're not really doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You might be doing some other form of grappling, but you're not doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Next question. I've been practicing Muay Thai and kickboxing for 3 years now and want to add standing grappling or wrestling art for the streets to complement my training. I don't want a grappling art like BJJ, rolling around on the street floor with broken glass and dog shit. And if the attacker has 2 or 3 friends to kick me on the head when I'm on the floor, in your expert opinion, which standing, grappling, or wrestling art is practical and effective with throws and quick takedowns for the street? Ronald. I'm going to answer this in 2 stages. The first stage is really easy. Ready? Judo or wrestling? There, that's a 3-word answer. Judo or wrestling. Both of them have throws and quick takedowns for the street. Now, I can't resist giving you a second answer as well. It's pretty foolish to say that you just want to work your stand-up grappling without working some level of ground defense. If I'm in a street fight, I'm probably not going to be pulling guard onto the street floor with sharp glass and dog shit, and if the attacker has 2 or 3 friends to kick me in the head when I'm on the floor, like you said. I'm going to be trying to use my stand-up techniques. The ground stuff is if everything else goes wrong. If you get tackled to the ground, if you're absolutely getting your ass handed to you in the stand-up situation, then you're going to try and go for a takedown, take the guy down, and dominate him on the ground. As for 2 or 3 opponents, you got to be pretty high-level striker to defeat 2 or 3 opponents. Mostly that's a fantasy world. And imagine this scenario. I was just talking about this with someone on in the YouTube comment thread on a video that I just did called Striking or Grappling. Go to my self-defense tutorials YouTube channel. Look for a video called Striking or Grappling, which is best for self-defense. In the comments thread there, somebody pointed out that what if among the 2 or 3 people that you're fighting, one of them's a wrestler or one of them's a grappler? You're going to end up on the ground. Even if your judo's good, you can get bum rushed, you can get tripped, you can get tackled from behind, you can slip and fall on a banana peel. You need some kind of ground. Even getting up from the ground back to your feet, where you're going to use your throws and your takedowns and your Muay Thai and your kickboxing, getting up from the ground is a grappling skill. Chuck Liddell, famous UFC striker, very, very difficult to hold down on the ground. Why? Because he was a wrestler, because he did lots of jiu-jitsu. Getting up from the ground, back to your feet, is a grappling skill. So, go check out that video on the Self-Defense Tutorials YouTube channel, striking or grappling for self-defense, which is better? It's something like that. Next question. What do you do when you choke someone out in self-defense in a street fight situation? This is in response, I think, to some emails and some articles that I sent out in the Grapple Arts email newsletter talking about what to do when you choke someone unconscious in class. Because it can be very, very frightening. Let's start with in class or in a tournament. If you choke somebody unconscious, very commonly, they're going to start snoring. It's going to sound like... And then they're going to start doing the funky chicken. It looks like they're having an epileptic seizure. And then they're going to wake up. So this is super frightening the first time that you see it. First time I saw it, I was like, oh my God, my friend is dead. Turns out he wasn't dead. That was just part of the process of coming to. So what do you do in a street fight? Street fight changes a couple of things. Let's first talk about liability in a street fight. If you and I are in a fight and I punch you in the face and knock you out, I win, right? Well, no. If you fall in an uncontrolled manner, hit your head on the pavement, crack your skull, and die, I'm legally on the hook for that. I can be charged, depending on the state, with murder or manslaughter, and people have gone to jail for decades for this exact crime. The one-punch KO resulting in a death equals jail time, lots of jail time. So you are responsible for what happens in a street fight. I think that's actually, to go back to the previous question, a great answer for the guy who was worried about not wanting to roll around on the ground with sharp glass and dog shit. Because it's much safer to choke someone unconscious than it is to punch them in the head or kick them in the head and have them fall in an uncontrolled manner. That being said, from a first responder perspective, when firefighters or paramedics or first aid attendants attend to someone who's unconscious, one of the big concerns is that that person's tongue blocks their airway. When you and I are lying flat on our backs and we're sleeping, our tongue doesn't block the back of our airway. We're not sufficiently unconscious. And if it does, we wake up and we shift a little bit, we never think about it. If you're completely unconscious, whether it's from a punch to the head, a drug overdose, a stroke, whatever, it's perfectly possible to choke to death lying on your back, on your tongue. You're going to choke to death on your tongue, or if you're super unlucky, if you throw up, that vomit stays in your mouth and you die. So, standard procedure, if there are no spinal injuries, is for paramedics, firefighters, first aid attendants to roll the person onto their stomach in what's called a three-quarter prone position. I'm running out of time here. I'm not going to describe three-quarter prone. Do a quick little Google search for three-quarter prone position first aid, and you'll see it. It's easy. Basically, the person's face is face down so that their tongue doesn't hang and cover the back of their throat. It hangs down towards the ground. If they happen to throw up, it rolls out of their mouth. So, in a street fight, to answer your question, if I choked somebody out and was either going for help or bravely running away, I would probably roll the person to three-quarter prone before leaving. Assuming, of course, that the guy's friends aren't coming around the corner. You know, there's so many variables in a street fight, it's really hard to say exactly what you should be doing. Next question. How to gain weight in the best and most practical way for Jiu-Jitsu? So this is a question about gaining weight from James. This is an interesting question because most people are interested in losing weight. James wants to gain weight. There's a simple two-step procedure here, really. One is to lift heavy. By lift heavy, I mean weights. And the other is to eat more. Let's talk about those quickly in succession. There are no shortage of bodybuilding resources about this, and they'll have another cheat at the end of it. So, lifting heavy. Bicep curls and wrist curls and calf raises are not lifting heavy, not in the sense that I mean. You want to do big lifts that involve multiple body parts across multiple joints, like the squat, like the deadlift, like the bench press, like the bent over row, like weighted pull-ups. These are big movements that challenge more than one muscle group. And what you'll find, for example, when I do squats, immediately I need more sleep. That night I need more sleep. And the next day I'm much hungrier. These are hormonal effects involving that much of your body. Straining that hard elicits a big hormonal response. That hormonal response that makes you eat more and sleep more is exactly what you're looking for. Because it's telling your body, look, you're under a lot of stress, you better pack on some muscle to help protect you against the stress. That's enough about the lifting part. Next part, eating. Most people are trying to gain weight and simply aren't eating enough. They think they are. They think they're eating all the time. But when you take a look at how bodybuilders eat and how frequently they eat and how much they eat, eating is a full-time job. My goal once was to get to 240 pounds with abs from about a starting point of 205 pounds. And I made it to 228 pounds with abs. And you know what stopped me? It was all the bloody eating. I couldn't take getting up, eating breakfast. Mid-morning, having a protein shake. Noon, having lunch, which is usually a cup of rice, cup of uncooked rice, with a can of tuna and hot sauce. Afternoon, having another protein shake. Dinner, having another meal. Before bedtime, having eggs. That's like 6 meals a day. And it was driving me crazy. The eating was driving me crazy. Most people trying to gain weight don't eat enough. Another quick fix, doesn't really gain muscle, but it does gain weight and it does make you stronger. And works for most people, is fairly safe, is creatine. You can buy it over the counter, creatine monohydrate. It'll add, for most people, somewhere in the 2 to 7 pounds of weight. A lot of that's water weight, but because of the chemistry of creatine, how it interacts with your body, it does make you stronger, it does increase your endurance, it does make you larger, it does make you heavier. You shouldn't be taking it if you're trying to cut weight for a tournament, but if you're trying to gain weight, it's a good intermediate measure. If you stop taking the creatine, it'll go away, but if you're trying to bump up a weight class or something, it's something I would try. Doesn't work for everyone. Works, I don't know what the numbers are. 3/4 of people that I know have tried it, it's worked for, and it's been studied a long time. So as long as you're taking low doses, I don't think it's anything to worry about. It occurs naturally in a lot of food anyway. Finally, I've got a question from Mr. Russell about the gogoplata from rubber guard or finishing the armbar from rubber guard. And I'm going to say, I am not your man for this. Sorry. I used to play a bit of rubber guard. It was the craze. I was fairly flexible. I could put one foot behind my head, but that was the limits of my flexibility. And one day I was applying, I think it was the crowbar to finish the omoplata. I was doing it against a bigger guy, and I'd done this move successfully many times before. And the guy turned and lunged at me, and my knee went pop, pop, pop. And it took like 5 years for that knee, the outside of that knee, to feel better. It hurt me for a long time. I think that in order to be able to do rubber guard, your minimum flexibility requirements are really to be able to put both your legs behind your own head. Now I know rubber guard aficionados will say, no, it's all in the positioning. If you have your hips in the right position, the right angle on your opponent, you don't need to be that flexible. And that's true, but I think if something goes wrong, if you run into a big aggressive guy who's got big shoulders, or somebody who's drives into you all of a sudden out of nowhere, or somebody who's really erratic in their movements, or somebody falls when they're trying to stand, you need to have that buffer. You can't be at the limits of your flexibility and be trying to do that whole leg climbing up around the head. Because if you're at your limits of flexibility already, you're going to get hurt if something goes wrong. So you need a buffer of flexibility. And in my semi-educated opinion about the rubber guard, I think being able to put both your legs behind your own head is a good starting place. So I'm not the man to answer your gogoplata questions or your armbar from rubber guard questions. There are a whole lot of 10th Planet guys putting out a whole lot of videos on YouTube. Go check those out. Okay, my brother's standing at the door. We got to head out. Thank you so much for listening. If you get the chance, I would really appreciate a rating and a review on iTunes for this podcast. I'm planning on doing a lot more with this podcast, and that rating or review would really help. If you don't like it, go ahead. Give me the 1 star. If you like it, 5 star, I'd be eternally grateful to you. Take care. Good luck with your training, and catch you in the next podcast. Podcast listeners, if you're listening, there's a good chance that you're into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I hope that you are. It's the best martial art out there. But nevertheless, if you do Jiu-Jitsu, if you do grappling, if you do MMA, I've got a book out there. It's called A Roadmap to BJJ, and it covers the fundamentals of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It covers the techniques and the positions. It's got checklists. It's a super useful resource, and it's completely free. If you go to grapplearts.com/book. You can download it. It's also on Amazon Kindle where you can buy it if you want to go that way. But I'm going to suggest the free route, which is grapplearts.com/book. Check it out. I get feedback almost every day from people who found this super useful in finally getting through and understanding the ground game, and it finally making sense for them, and it finally not being so intimidating anymore. Check it out. I think you'll find it really useful too.